The United States. The United States became a superpower at the end of World War II. And for a time it was the only superpower, and for a very short time, the United States was the only country in the world that had the atomic bomb. Then the United States, shortly after World War II, experienced a lot of competition from Russia, or from the Soviet Union. Then the Soviet Union declined. The United States began to have competition from China. But now the Soviet Union seems to be, Russia seems to be picking up. But anyway, and your book has the United States as the world's foremost military power. Folk, that's in your author's opinion. It might still be so. All right. A lot of persons say the United States prestige abroad is at the lowest it's been in many, many a year. Okay, we'll move on. Back up to the United States began to move toward a welfare state, just like the rest of Europe, just like Europe and Canada had, except the United States moved more slowly. The United States did not have health care until it started last year. And the United States health care is a little bit different from the health care the other countries have had. But again, folk, I'm not going to speculate on how well it works. Well, yes, I will. I will say this. I don't think that the health care we have is going to work. And it has not worked other places where it's been tried. But nevertheless, we now have universal, supposedly universal health care. Truman was our president. I'm going to write these names down. First it was Truman, then Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford. I'm going to pause right here. I mean, there was Reagan and Bush, Clinton and another Bush, and Obama. The United States did not go back to a depression after the war ended. A lot of persons feared when the war is over, the United States took depression. It didn't. For one thing, President Truman encouraged a lot of soldiers to go to college by passing the GI Bill of Rights that said, hey, you can't find a job, well, go back to college, or go to college, and the American federal government will help you. Get your degree, and then you'll be more employable. And this kept some people out of the workforce for a while. But in addition, there was a demand for civilian goods, including automobiles. The automobile had not been made during World War II. So all of a sudden in 1946, the automobiles were produced again, and a lot of persons bought them, so there was still a high employment rate. Truman became unpopular after the United States got involved in Korea. Then Eisenhower became president. I want to say this about Eisenhower. He was the first president I remember. He was president when I was a kid. He was a very popular president, two-term, and maybe the last president in our country's history who actually found some happiness in the office. It has brought most of the men who have had it to grief, particularly those who have been elected to a second term, have been brought to grief. But anyway, when Eisenhower left office, he was rated as a very mediocre president, but after our country went through Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and Carter and Ford too, after our country went through a series of seemingly failed presidencies, Eisenhower's rating gets higher and higher as time goes on, and they go, hey, maybe the man wasn't bad after all. Eisenhower refused to get the United States involved in a war. After going through World War II, he was very much a man of peace. And a lot of persons say, hey, you should have done more to help Hungary. He should have done more to help Vietnam. He should have done more to help the black people in the United States. He didn't. But now people realize that maybe a benign presidency was what the country needed. Now, in the 1960s, when I was a kid, they looked on this as being a period of benign presidency. But then with Johnson particularly, the young people rose up and rebelled and rioted. Anyway, Kennedy became president, and underneath the surface had been rumblings of racial discord. And this racial discord began to come to a head under Eisenhower, came to another head under Kennedy, and a big head under Johnson, as blacks rioted in the streets, led by a man named, one of the leaders was Dr. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. Their grievance was that they were being treated like second-class citizens, and I think all of you know what I'm talking about. The black people were told they had to go to separate schools, and the schools were never as good as white schools. The blacks were told they had to use separate restroom facilities, drink from separate water fountains, and they were not welcome in most restaurants except for their own restaurants, but they were not welcome in white restaurants. Again, after a lot of rioting, a lot of discord, the Civil Rights Acts were passed. Oh yeah, blacks were denied the right to vote in the South. This was true pretty much up until about 1970. By that time, the blacks had overcome a lot of the obstacles for voting. I want to say about the schools. Today's Southern schools are more segregated than they were in the 1960s, which are segregated by choice, not by mandate. The black parents have simply chosen that they'd rather send their children to a black school than a white school. But the black schools are no longer as inferior as they were back then. Black-only restaurants, white-only restaurants are now out of the norm. White-only restrooms no longer allowed. White-only water fountains, again, you don't see. Eisenhower gave way to Kennedy. John Kennedy. They still talk about him, they still make movies about him. He only was able to serve a little bit less than 3 years, or slightly more than half of his term. I want to comment this about him. The man, to me, nothing about him was what it appeared. All right, the image he presented was an image of a youthful president, vigorous, a family man, very much in love with his wife, very much a man who is devoted to his 2 children. None of that was really true. In actual reality, he was an extremely sick man. And only a few people were allowed to see his records. I mean, one man said, I was told I had 40 minutes to look at his health records, and I was not allowed to copy anything or photograph anything. So he said, this man, we don't know how he stayed alive. The chances are, if he had not been shot down by a bullet, he would probably have died in office. He had a really bad doctor, a quack. We call him Dr. Feelgood. I don't know what his real name was, but Dr. Feelgood would give him pain medicines. And Kennedy was taking about scores of medicines every day. Most of them just placebos or pain medicines to keep down pain. Again, it was like he knew he wouldn't live long. The president also was an extreme womanizer, but we did not find out any of this until 4 years after he died. This began to come out. It was said that everybody in Washington knew about his affairs. Everybody, the press knew about it, but they wouldn't. In those days, the press wouldn't publish it. Now that's not true today. But in those days, the press wouldn't publish it. I say it's not true, but supposedly it's not true. But particularly, he had an affair with a woman named Ellen Romsch, who is now believed to have been a communist spy. The Secret Service were told, if you know Jackie's away, and some woman comes walking up to the president's door, you're to stand aside and let her in. And the Secret Service was saying to themselves, well, how can What if she's an assassin? How can we protect our president? Well, folk, they couldn't. And also, there was a fear that the president was giving away secrets. Now, folk, I tried to document this, but there was a documentary on TV about 1995 or so, where that they said that, well, it's known that when Kennedy was shot, the Senate was in a session, and Robert was in the session with the Senate, Robert, his brother. It is believed that they were discussing his affair with Ellen Romsch. And that could have been grounds for impeachment, owing to the fact that Ellen Romsch was an East German woman and might have been a communist spy. Now, what Robert Kennedy did for his brother, Robert Kennedy was trying to cover, Robert Kennedy gave Ellen Romsch a one-way ticket back to Germany and said that, in effect, I'll send you money later. And Ellen knew that if she didn't take that one-way ticket, she could expect something to happen to her. To this day, Ellen Romsch will not talk about the incident. Now, how many of you, you're younger folk, and if you don't want to raise your hand, how many of you have heard of Marilyn Monroe by any chance? All right, there is a rumor circulating, and every time I teach you, somebody in class heard that Robert Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe. Have any of you happened to hear anything about that? Essentially, Marilyn Monroe's death was officially ruled as suicide. Marilyn Monroe had problems. She was bipolar, she was suicidal, she went through periods of extreme depression. But she had affairs with both John and Robert. This is now well known. And she was threatening to reveal to the world. And Robert Kennedy, all right, here's what we know about Robert's whereabouts. And even outside, both sides admit this. Robert Kennedy was at a party 50 miles from Marilyn Monroe's home. For 9 hours, Robert Kennedy disappeared from the party. Now, it was never unheard of for a Kennedy boy to disappear from some party. Anyway, for 9 hours, Robert disappeared. Then 9 hours came back up to appear at the party. During those 9 hours, he was away, and Marilyn Monroe died. 9 persons saw Robert near Marilyn Monroe's house, or Marilyn Monroe's dwelling, including at least 1 or 2 police officers. When they found Marilyn Monroe's body, they found a window had been broken, but the glass was inside the house. Now, any of you know anything about breaking windows? To get the glass to fall inside, so the person who broke it had to be outside. You know, it indicated somebody from outside broke in, broke a window. Again, folk, that's not enough proof. If you don't believe it, you don't have to. We don't have the proof. And Joe DiMaggio, one of Marilyn Monroe's husbands, went to his grave insisting that he believed that Robert Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe in an attempt to cover up. I mean, hey, I was alive back then. And some people believe our country could not have taken. The Cold War was in full swing. A president who was such a womanizer, and also womanizing the people who might have been communistic spies. It seemed like I got to class at least partially awake. Most of you seem to be listening. All right, anybody heard of anything about any of this or have any comments? I mean, I had one student just insist, no, he didn't kill her because, and I had one student say, folks, this is something I could almost back it up, that Robert Kennedy's morality was too high for him to have engaged in something so low. I had to almost bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. The Kennedy men had no morals. You heard me say that. Yes. And they would do anything to protect their presidency. Now, I want to say this, though. You might think, I've told you, I think Kennedy was alive, but he did one thing right. That one thing was the Cuban Missile Crisis. He saved the world from a nuclear war. And folks, that almost makes up for every bad deed he ever did. It's like he was the right man in the right place, the right time, saved the world from nuclear war, and shortly after that, he passed off the scene. Now, he had some problems in his presidency. Number one problem, he could not get his legislation passed. And it was a shame because he had as his vice president Lyndon Johnson, And Johnson, all he had to do is tell Johnson, hey Johnson, I want you to get this through the Senate, through the House. Instead, Kennedy tried to just shut Johnson on the shelf, and for 2 or 3 years we heard nothing about our vice president. I remember even a Beetle Bailey comic talked about, you don't hear from the vice president anymore. My 8th grade history teacher, we never hear about the vice president anymore. I mean, I recall when Eisenhower was president, you'd hear about Vice President Nixon all the time, but Kennedy kept, and that was a shame because Johnson, we believe, could have gotten the legislation through. Johnson knew his way around the Senate. And the vice president is, after all, head of the Senate according to the Constitution. But Johnson sat there for 3 years, moping and doing absolutely nothing. Now, another good thing that came out of Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, through his Attorney General, prosecuted the mafia more than any other president's combined. I mean, more than any other Attorney General combined. He prosecuted the mafia. You don't hear as much about the mafia as you once did, even though they're still around.